So I'm excited.
Yeah, I'm excited too. I'm excited to welcome everybody to Reimagining the Future, Earth and Global Justice Days at Sac City College. And today's theme is Sustainable Futures. We'll have another day of full, exciting programming next week, next Thursday, with under the theme of global justice. So our goal here with events and invited presenters like Dr. Breeze Harper, we're really happy to have today, is 2 years into this pandemic that hopefully we're coming out of. Our goal is to reconnect our communities, both locally and globally, and to invite you by way of these special sessions to learn more about the rich world around us and to consider Sac City as your home base for education and advancement of your life goals. We have a dazzling array of classes and programs, amazing students, dedicated expert faculty, all just waiting for you. And speaking of amazing dedicated faculty, one of my favorite stellar colleagues is Professor Mark Dennis, who is an incredible teacher and dedicated scholar, who is going to say a few words to introduce Dr. Harper today and get us started on our program. Mark.
All right, excellent. Thank you so much, Professor Bahor. So just one really quick announcement before we get started. So we're going to ask that you save your questions until the end. So there should be enough time for a little bit of Q&A at the end. If you do have questions or comments that you want to put in the chat, that is completely acceptable too. I will definitely be monitoring that and kind of consolidating some of the comments and questions that are there. So that works as well. But with that said, I am very excited to introduce Dr. Breeze Harper to you today. So Dr. Harper is an equity and inclusion professional who explores the world of food justice and sustainability through the lens of Black feminism, decolonization, Afrofuturism, and Afrofantasy. So I'm not going to give you her entire resume because it would probably take up the rest of the time, but I do want to share with you some of the highlights. So she has a BA in geography, and she also received the Innovative Thesis Award for her work on heterosexism in rural geographies. She has an MA in educational technologies and a PhD in social sciences with an emphasis on intersectionality, anti-racism, and racial and gender inclusion and equity. In 2015, she organized the highly successful conference, Vegan Practice of Black Lives Matter, and she is also the author of 3 books, including the upcoming novel, Seeds of Sankofa. So with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Harper.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate being invited to be part of this and a lovely introduction. So here we go. So my name is Dr. Amy Breeze Harper. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. And I am premiering this year more of my novel writing and exploring sustainability, food, and racial justice through this art of writing novels, specifically Afrofantasy and Afrofuturism. So I just wanted to make sure that I define these terms clearly because they're part of the title and the content of what I'll be talking about. So Afrofantasy is a genre fantasy featuring mainly Black characters and it's set in a fantasy version of Africa, a fantasy setting inspired by Africa or among African diasporic populations encountering magic. And more. So let me just try to move the screen. Magic anywhere. So it's, it's a very broad topic, but what really makes it center is that we're not living in a post-racial world when we write about fantasy and magic. Multiverse, a collection of different universes that are thought by some people to exist at the same time. What we think of as the universe could be just one of trillions of universes on an indescribably vast stage called the multiverse. It is possible that somewhere else in this larger structure that we call the multiverse, there are people like us. So I wanted to begin with a story and then talk about why it's important and kind of move into reading an excerpt from my novel. So here we go. And I'll be looking on the left because my notes are on this side, the lecture itself, but the camera's in front of me with the slides. So, what happens when human beings cannot grow as their biodynamic, authentic selves, but instead gestate in a system in which monoculturalism is both cultivated and normalized? When I arrived at the semi-homestead that I had grown up in rural southern New England, my parents were nowhere to be found. The vibrant yard of 3 acres, complete with an orchard nestled in the back that hosted everything from pawpaws to black currants to blueberries, is now barely recognizable as the fecund space it used to be. Flora that used to be alive, representing every color of the rainbow, is now a color spectrum of desiccated grays. The Macintosh trees, my childhood favorite, look as if they had died howling in agony. Bark peeled back, shriveled up. Everything is gray. Not the calm grays of hibernation before spring anew, but the type of grays that signified infinite death of hope. Every plant that had been cultivated with love by my father was dead. Their remnants, dried out hulls that used to encapsulate unique spirits that my father had helped to sow and birth through hands that had been born in 1943 July during Jim Crow era in Mississippi. Had the pestilence somehow found him and my mother after all of these years? The same pestilence that had driven their parents living in Mississippi and Georgia to escape the contamination and flee north to Michigan and Connecticut, hoping that the disease would not be as decimating there, hoping that there would be a future of abundance under the warmth of other suns. I turn around away from the orchard and then try to see if I can find the 1,600 square foot, 3-bedroom red and green house they had taken a mortgage out on in 1978. The single level home now looked gray, half of the structure having collapsed. The home where I had made numerous peach and apple cobblers with my mother, much like the orchard, looked like its debilitation had been in anguish. The pestilence had gutted the house. Mom had told me that they had discovered black mold within and throughout the walls of the house a few years ago. However, they staunchly decided that they would not leave. The land and that home symbolized a richly cultivated life that they had seemingly and finally escaped from, but had plagued their parents in Mississippi and Georgia. I sob and sob, trying to find my mother and father. I sob at the realization that the future they wanted to plant for themselves and their children had lost to the same plague that ignited hundreds of years ago when the first ship of enslaved Africans reached the shores of Virginia in 1619. Though in reality, my parents are actually still alive on that 3 acres of what used to be inhabited by the Mohegan people, I have had that recurring dream too many times to count. It's not all the time, but sometimes when I enter that ethereal sphere of dreams of future past, my childhood sanctuary is no more. I have shared the dream with my family frequently. Dad's convinced that I'm seeing the future. Actually, let me take that back. I was witnessing one of many possible futures shaped by the fact that the colonization, genocide, and enslavement of flora, fauna, and people throughout the world will most likely end with a dead planet. It could also represent my own fears of losing an abundant future of possibility, justice, and hope. More than botanical seeds were planted when this Black family moved into that rural white town during the Carter administration in 1978. Within a week of us setting foot onto our new home, a white neighbor would put up a for sale sign on his property, while a white service provider Dad had hired to install something in the house had asked, "How can you people afford this house?" Harper roots set down. They would be a powerful force breaking down and disrupting the bedrock of colonialism and supremacy that had perpetuated the normalcy of unquestioned purity through homogeneity. Look at that skinny little nigger. Run, skinny little nigger, run. On the first day of the 7th grade, in a crowded hall of students coming back from a hot and humid summer vacation, I was greeted with those 2 sentences. George Bush Sr. had recently won the US presidency, catapulted by his successful Willie Horton campaign that reminded white America that unless controlled and imprisoned, Black men will defile and kill their white daughters. Whiteness was purity. Whiteness was the normalized monoculture. Within what is now the USA, those seeds of scarcity had been planted since around 1619, if not before, and it was what my grandparents had been trying to escape. Look at that skinny little nigger run, skinny little nigger run. It's really the only thing I remember about the first day of middle school, and it took root into my body. Those two sentences would actually be the impetus for my life's passion of trying to show how racial justice, decolonization, and a sustainable food system cannot exist in or on soil that continues to be, quote unquote, purified through supremacy and monocultural belief systems. The day before middle school would start, I remember eating one of our peaches while sitting on the grass at home. The earth underneath me was a reflection of how my parents wanted the US to become. A cultivation of rich, diverse, interconnected, symbiotic, and fertile ecosystem of beloved community, incubated and birthed from the granular darkness of creation. It was the antithesis of what had been planted in the head of the child that would throw the N-word at me the very next day. When we first arrived in 1978, my father had the soil and well water tested and would every year thereafter. He was determined to help rebalance the microbiome below, which had been altered by the town's chemical farming practices. Over the years, he would explain to my twin brother and I that the commercial fruits and vegetables in the grocery stores looked, quote unquote, pretty, clean, and glossy. But those were just lies. He had told us, that stuff is grown within dead soil from chemical fertilizers. It looks pretty, but it's not nutritionally dense and it's void of life. This isn't sustainable, but that's what most people think is normal. And why would the mainstream question that norm when what was displayed looked shiny, pretty, and innocuous? Why unearth and investigate the rhetoric of false purity sold to us through a capitalist frame of an unquestioned monoculture of both land and minds? I remember the countless days riding the school bus and passing by acres of corn, smelling chemical pesticides and fertilizers in the air. A picturesque landscape of disingenuous abundance in an informally white segregated town of many struggling farmers. My professional life as a diversity, equity, and inclusion consultant for the sustainable food sector has never really been about food or even veganism. It has been about questioning monocultural thinking systems that stripped away beloved communities within the soil and or within human beings and non-human animal social systems. I'd observed popular sustainable food organizations spouting how the entire planet's human population must go vegan or buy organic commodities. Simultaneously, they'd be a monoculture of white leadership. A significant number believe that if there were any mention of how indigenous genocide, enslaved Africans, and systemic racism are the reasons why US soil exists, this would taint the purity of a supposed post-racial sustainable food movement. For many of them, the answer to a future of plenty is to simply create quantities of vegan and organic food commodities while ignoring the pestilence of a globalized white supremacist capitalist system. They refuse to unearth the contradictions of their own racialization into the monoculture of whiteness. Soil. We are birthed from the soil. We are birthed into the soil. If I know the soil, then I will always know where my family is, because I will always know where home is. A people who do not know their soil do not know themselves. This quote is an excerpt from my Afrofantasy and Afrofuturistic novel in progress, Seeds of Sankofa, and reflects the principles of the fictional Pototi people of the African diaspora. Dispossessed as the result of transatlantic slavery, the Pototi have unique paranormal abilities connected to the sacred multiverse of Earth's soil microbiome and fight to save it. The book proposes that millions in the United States do not know their biodynamically authentic selves. And this is a consequence of a 450 plus year old racial caste, capitalist, and colonialist system that was built on top of soil turned USA, in which the soil's microbiome was also colonized. My Seeds of Sankofa project began in 2019. It came out of my love of cli-fi, Afrofantasy, and Afrofuturistic novelists and creators such as Aya De Leon, Indy Okorafor, and Octavia Butler. It came out of my love for my parents and having grown up in a home with an orchard and basically a moral base of the land and the body being connected, and the way that you treat the land will be reflective of how you treat others and your own body. I think more significantly, though, it came out of my desire to inspire decolonization of the imagination during a time in which many of us consume the narrative that the future can only be dystopian. The other week, I attended the UC Berkeley event, Black Literature versus Climate Emergency. A panelist of Black cli-fi authors spoke on many topics. Tori Stevens, the climate fiction manager at Grist, noticed that there tends to be this trend, an absence of specific racial ethnic food culture, as well as the erasure of Blackness in sci-fi. Granted, we can see that a character in a sci-fi, fantasy, or cli-fi movie or series is Black, but the specificity of their Blackness, as well as the specificity of their cultural foodways, are largely absent in the character's development. Stevens also noted how many of us, at least here in the United States, are addicted to dystopian narratives thrown at us by popular and albeit well-written shows such as Black Mirror. What would happen if instead we employ the creative genres of cli-fi, Afrofantasy, or indigenous futurisms, to name a few, to find creative solutions, possibilities, and a hope of a more healed and regenerated future? To move into creating a multiverse of possibilities that start with the seeds of decolonized imagination that dare to ask the question, what if? Before I invite you to listen to my reading of excerpts from Seeds of Sankofa, and I invite you to ask yourself these questions if you have not already. And these questions apply to botanical and psychological seeds, and we'll be revisiting them at the end, but you can start thinking about some of these in relation to what I had read, but also to some things that may be happening or have happened in your life. How do I create a future of plenty if I haven't even acknowledged the erasure of our microbiome histories, both of soil and myself? Can I discern which are disingenuous seeds that are still rooted in supremacy, segregation, and monoculture, and which seeds would bring forth a beloved community? Is a future of plenty about quantity or quality? So I hope that these questions can inspire us to think about a future of plenty within the abundance of a biodynamic and beloved community. So now I want to step into the next part where I begin to explore a lot of what I've been speaking about within the creative arts realm of Afrofantasy. And this is the prologue that I'll be reading from my book called Seeds of Sankofa. So the prologue is titled Okra and Willow Tree, and it's taking place July 30th, 1985. And I'm going to read voices of different characters, and I tried to make the voices different so you can distinguish who's saying what. July 30th, 1985. Why does Madhu always smell the soil? The perky 5-year-old asked. She wiggled her toes into the loosened earth and heavy mulch that they had been placing on top of the soil all morning at Madhu's request. He grinned back at her, his Tuskegee University t-shirt wet with sweat. No matter how hot the sun would get, he would never wear a hat. She jammed the trowel with strawberry shortcake cartoon characters on the pink handle into the ground and then twisted it. She had always loved anticipating what type of sounds it would make as it penetrated the earth. Fafa, the soil tells her very important things. She's reading it with her nose and loves feeling it in her hands. She gathers wonderful stories from it. The earth told her that it's here that we should build our home, cultivate the land, and then grow the food that would nourish you while you grew in your mommy's belly. Fafa looked at her Baga and then crumpled her eyebrows. That's impossible, Baga. The soil can't talk to people. People can't talk to soil. She then giggled, inserted her shovel into the wheelbarrow filled with mulch. Several grubs squirmed on top. She carefully lifted one up as Baga looked over her shoulder. Looks like you probably got yourself a Japanese beetle larva. I like those. They're luminescent when they turn into beetles. That's what Madhu says. I think you mean luminescent. That's what I said, Baga. Luminescent. She scratched the skin underneath the strap of her straw hat and then started to yawn, but then tried to suppress it. She didn't want to take a nap, but then furrowed her eyebrows as she felt the yawn come through stronger. This time, she let her mouth wide open to succumb to the yawn. Don't fall asleep. I can't fall asleep. I can't miss the ceremony. Baba heard her whispering to herself. They had kept her awake for the past 24 hours, and she had been doing surprisingly well. She had complained minimally, mostly because she had been taught how important this next phase was. He reached out and gently touched her forehead with the back of his index finger, dark circles under her eyes, but pupils and brown irises full of life. How about we listen to some Marvin? The worms were digging it last time. Get it? Digging it? He laughed to himself. She giggled and said, Mommy's right that you are so corny sometimes, Baga. Baga crooned in unison with the music coming out of the Panasonic boombox he had refurbished, sitting on top of a white tarp several feet away from them. Fafa quietly toiled away, adding the heavy mulch to the topsoil for 10 more minutes until they heard, Fafa, Baga, we are ready. It is time. Madhu's summoning shout came from across the field of soil that had been feeding mulch to. She and Fafa's mother were holding each other's hands, bodies turned towards each other while sitting on the large red blanket that her mother had knitted last winter. They were under the 60-year-old weeping willow tree that had mesmerized Fafa since she was an infant. When the wind blew, she had always rejoiced in how the willow branches and leaves moved, as if they were flowing calmly underneath an invisible, gentle river. As she and Baga slowly ambled towards the two women, Fafa watched and smiled as Madhu gently kissed her mother on the lips and then stroked her neck with the back of her slender fingers. It had always made her feel happy and cozy when they'd hold and kiss each other. Is the party starting? Fafa asked as she sillily plopped down on Madhu's lap that was covered by her white linen dress. I'm going to check on Lupita and the baby. Let you ladies do what you need to do. Be brave, my little Fafa, Baga said, winking at Fafa as everyone could barely hear a baby crying in the distance. She nodded coolly at him with tired eyes. Yes, my love, the ceremony is beginning. You've practiced and prepared for so many weeks, Madhu had told her as she took off Fafa's straw hat, laid it down on the blanket, and then gently kissed her on the forehead. I'm so tired, Madhu, but I can do it. I think I can do it, Fafa whispered. You will be able to sleep soon, Madhu replied. Fafa turned her head to her mother, who was caressing the tender scar on her own hairline. Her lips barely parted as she whispered, Baby, we prepared the most lovely achu for the ceremony. Unlike Madhu, whose voice was always serene, her mother's voice was giving off a nervous vibration despite a smile that followed her words. Beside Fafa's hat, there was a tiny peat pot with a single sprouted okra plant. Fafa had sowed the seed a few weeks earlier in preparation for the ceremony. Baga had told Fafa that she needed to treat the seedling as treasure. The plant was a descendant from what was now called Ghana, via an ancestor who was captured, enslaved, and shipped across something called the Middle Passage. The ancestor had kept the seeds in her hair. Okra is sacred because it helps mommies and their babies be well while the baby grows inside. It is powerful, her mother had told her a few months ago when she was telling her their nightly botanical bedtime stories fused with fairy tales and hope. The first one had been about her favorite mystical mermaid-like goddess, Mami Wati, while the second had been a fantastical story about Wehehu, their people's sacred placenta burial ceremony in which okra was used and what they were now about to commence. Can you sing it to me before we go, Madhu? Madhu smiled, nodded, took a deep breath, and then parted her lips to release the short hymn she recited to Madhu several times a week. Soil, we are birthed from the soil, we are birthed into the soil. If I know the soil, then I will always know where my family is, because I will always know where home is. A people who do not know their soil do not know themselves. Thank you, Fafa whispered to her. Madhu carefully picked up the small pot, and then she gestured for them to stand up. Fafa held on strong to each of their hands as her mother caressed the willow tree's trunk and murmured something to it. For a brief moment, the place where her mother's fingers had touched pulsated and then shimmered with a reddish golden hue. Let's go, Madhu said to them. They led Fafa around the willow tree, towards the birthing herbs garden that they had been cultivating for years for the pregnant. Fafa crumpled her eyebrows and then stopped dead in her tracks. We're going back there? I don't want to go back there because it's going to happen to mommy again. Up until May of that year, Fafa had spent nearly every day with her mother in the garden during the spring, learning about what her mom called womb herbs. On the morning of May 13th, she had run out to the garden with her tin watering can, only to find Madhu and Baga holding her mother upright. Her mother was sitting on top of the evening primrose plants, gasping for air and coughing in between. Something that looked like black charcoal mixed with fresh blood was splattered across her face, crimson dripping down from her hairline and right nostril onto her white blouse, which was also freshly soiled with moist crimson and black powder. Her mother was shaking while tightly holding onto a blanket with something wrapped up inside that was making gurgling and choking sounds. Fafa heard her mother incoherently murmuring, "Philadelphia, everything on fire. They burned them, gone." At the terrifying sight of her bleeding mother, Fafa began screaming, startling all of them who hadn't seen her come. Take her away, Madhu had commanded Baga, who then quickly responded by grabbing the screaming child, covering her eyes, and then bringing her into the house. What if it happens to mommy again? What if she gets hurt again? Fafa whispered, suddenly wishing that she could turn into a Japanese beetle larva and safely hide in the warm mulch. I won't, honey. Please come. The Echu is waiting for you and your seedling, her mother whispered to her. She remembered Baga's words, be brave, and then reminded herself that Baga, Madhu, and her mother had always kept their promises to keep her safe. When Fafa arrived at the Echu ceremonial area, she saw a near perfect formation of a circle made from organite pyramids about 8 feet in diameter. The 6-inch high pyramids were infused with okra seeds and tiny remnants of Fafa's dried and biblical cord. In the center was fresh topsoil with 3 freshly dug holes inside, 2 of which were about 5 inches in diameter, the third approximately 12 inches. Inside the circle was also the placenta, wrapped in an off-white beeswax linen cloth. Madhu, Fafa, and her mother had decorated the cloth with crushed dried okra flowers and whole okra seeds fused onto the cloth using beeswax. It was the placenta that Fafa had fed from while she gestated inside of her mother. About 10 feet away from the circle, Madhu removed her clothes, kneeled down to the earth, and then placed her palms on top of the soil. 5 indigo quarter-sized circles with a slight hue of red iridescence and in the shape of a backwards L ran down her spine. Echu wati, Fafa heard Madhu whisper loudly 3 times in a row. The air swallowed her, and then Madhu was gone. Subtle remnants of red dust floated just above the soil where Madhu had been kneeling. Gripping onto her mother's hand in anticipation, Fafa patiently waited for about 15 seconds. A few days ago, Madhu had told her that once she and her mother were finished creating the Echu from the inside out, only Fafa would be able to step over the threshold and into the completed circle. However, Madhu would have to redshift somewhere undisclosed and then come back within the Echu to consecrate the soil. To you, it will seem like I was only gone for a few minutes, but for me, it will be much longer. When I come back, I may look different or have some boo-boos, but do not panic. No matter what you see, Fafa, your Madhu will be okay. Madhu had told her a week ago as she cuddled in between her mother and her in their bed just before she fell asleep. Now, it is time for you to do what we have practiced, her mother gently whispered to Fafa. She nodded, let go of her mother's warm hand, took her seedling, and then stepped over the threshold of the echu. The air felt charged as she experienced what could only be described as sparkling shocks, similar to when she'd removed blankets from the dryer with her mother during their New England winters. She set her seedling into the first 5-inch hole. Echuwati pototi, echuwati pototi, echuwati pototi, she chanted over and over again as she bowed 3 times to the wrapped placenta, carefully lifted it up, and then placed it into the 12-inch hole that was about 18 inches deep. After, she laid down in between the planted seedling and placenta, and then placed her palms down flat onto the rich soil. Still chanting, she felt static electricity lightly popping all over her body. She heard her mother begin to drum and chant along with her. After several minutes, a nude Madhu suddenly reemerged from within the charged air, gracefully landed on top of the soil, and then promptly transitioned into a kneeling position within the circle. Fafa turned her head to see Madhu's slightly trembling right hand, which was holding soil with a sprout on top, her left palm firmly on the earth. She was breathing rapidly, and there were abrasions and bruises all over her arms and legs, but her eyes were bright with courage and determination as they made contact with Fafa's irises, followed by her warm and loving smile. Madhu placed the sprout into the last hole above Fafa's head. As Fafa and her mother chanted to the drum, Fafa's heart began to beat rapidly as she felt the earth beneath her vibrate and gently massage her body. I will be brave. I will be brave, she thought as she tried not to think about what had happened to her mother recently. I, Madhu of Pototi, redshifter and midwife of creation, summon Echuwati. I bring forth the trinity of the symbolic past. Madhu waved her left hand over the placenta. The present, waved her hand over Fafa's okra seedling. And the futures, and then waved her hand over the sprout she had placed into the hole. Fafa breathed deeply into her empty belly, which had been fasting since after yesterday's lunch. She clutched the warm, moist soil as the vibrations of the drum and chanting moved the red mineral dust particles above her, in orchestrated harmony, coalescing into a circular pattern about 5 feet in diameter. The energized particles flowed counterclockwise, attracting more of itself from an unforeseen place until the entire circle was colored with fantastical shimmering red particles, sparkling and shifting as one plasmic body, flowing into itself as concentric waves. With pride and joy, Madhu observed as Fafa's fully open eyes began to transform in color, echoing the metamorphic hue emitting from the portal. So here's a perspective shift. As she chanted, she tried to subvert the nauseating feeling slowly growing in the same belly that had carried Fafa a little over a half decade ago. Madhu had assured them that everything would be okay. After all, her beloved had done the ceremony many times before. It had always ended with a Pototi child safely receiving transmission from an ancestor, connecting the youth to the ancestral web of communal shifting over the last millennia. Without this sacred transmission, a rogue shifter, especially a young child, would not make it on their own. It's just your nerves, it's just anxiety, just chant and breathe, she thought to herself. She beat the drum a little harder and watched as Madhu began to summon Echuwati. The magnificent red portal levitated and pulsated above Madhu and Fafa. She breathed deeply into her belly, chanting and drumming, while she tried to enjoy Fafa's ceremonial rite of passage. Suddenly, an intense twisting pain erupted slightly below her sacral chakra. She had felt the same agonizing sensation before when she had been in Philadelphia earlier that year. Sage had been bundled up in her arms as she tried to muster the strength to redshift back to the birthing garden hundreds of miles away. At the time, she thought it was simply a normal rescue, but under horribly human-made circumstances. She had tried to convince herself that the painful sensation was probably the result of injury from the explosives, coupled with disorientation and confusion from her mild concussion. However, within the destruction from human-made bombs that had destroyed Sage's home, there had actually been something immaterial lurking and using the chaos as camouflage. She had kept this to herself, in denial, hoping it had not been there for her, but rather to feed off the suffering and grief that had come out of that day. But now it was here. Fast and incisive, the sonic entity embedded itself into the essence of her chant vibration, warping the harmonious incantation that had originally saturated the humid air. As she gasped in surprise, it used that to enter her through her breath. It planted itself into her lungs, abruptly seizing her chant. As a burning sensation arose, she clutched her chest as the possession forced her mouth wide open. She released a voluminous howl that was not her own, which emitted a vibrational frequency of ravenous despair and hopelessness. The earth shook. Perspective change. Madhu continued looking down at Fafa, whose eyes were now fully metallic red, signifying her connection to the plasmic portal. Thousands of tiny plasmic particles began to infuse into her body. As the particles began to coalesce more within her bloodstream, the pigmentation of the 5 circles began to manifest on her left forearm, painted with a deep blue with a red iridescent hue. Madhu looked up as she heard Imi's chant abruptly end, followed by a gasp. She witnessed her letting out a wailing yowl, and then the ground beneath them began to shake violently. She felt her heart begin to beat in panic, but then reminded herself that the Pototi's oath was to protect the child in portal first, which meant remaining within the consecrated circle, no matter what was occurring outside of it. Imi's body began to alter and it continued to howl. The radiant brown skin on her arms and legs started to transform into what Madhu could only interpret as a type of petrification. However, it wasn't just her body that was affected. The petrification spread rapidly, moving from her feet in different directions, consuming the garden. It reached the circle, but was unable to move into it. It was consecrated soil, but for how long would they be protected? As Madhu continued to chant, it became increasingly challenging to adhere to her oath and remain focused on Fafa. Though she had heard ancestral stories of disasters happening during a transmission ceremony, they had all been normal, i.e. hurricanes, aftermaths of earthquakes, human tribal wars, etc. Not this. In the distance, she saw her brother and Lupita running and holding the baby, escaping the house that had already started to petrify. Both barefoot, they were headed towards the willow tree. She saw her brother trip and then fall onto the ground. Unable to get up fast enough as the earth beneath them petrified, he was consumed. Grasping onto the baby who was swaddled in a bright green cloth, Lupita lunged towards the willow tree and then swung Sage upwards, just as the petrifying soil reached her right foot, bringing her down to the ground. With precise agility and dexterity, the willow tree intertwined and bent its branches and leaves into a bassinet formation, catching baby Sage. The willow vanished just before the petrification could reach it, leaving behind gold and blue colored shimmering dust in the space above the ground that the grand tree had just occupied. No, 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 look away and back onto Fafa, you took an oath, she heard in her mind shout. Madhu did not want to give into fear or panic. She had always been determined to not let fear and panic dictate her life or how to respond to crisis. This would truly test the limits of her calm pragmatism and faith. The strongest sign that the entity was breaking through the consecrated soil within the Echu was the change of scent below them. What she smelled rising up from the earth below their bodies was a melange of disharmony and anguish, tangled up in the acidic sense of grief and disorientation. The seedlings were beginning to lose their vibrancy. Fafa's transmission was only nearly halfway completed, and Madhu knew she had not regenerated fast enough to gain the energy she needed to shift away with the little one. She looked at Imi, whose body was being kept alive long enough for her vocal cords to be the entity's conduit. Imi was still able to produce tears of anguish and sorrow that began to stream down her paling cheeks. Madhu choked but tried to hold back her own tears. Everything was happening too fast. Her uncanny sense of smell revealed that she and Fafa only had a matter of seconds before the petrification would come up from the depths of the soil to consume them as well. Madhu quickly but gently scooped up the soil with the seed lead representing the futures, lifted Fafa from off of the earth, shouted to Emi, "This is not our end. I love you, my Emi," and then leapt through the portal with her daughter. So that's the end of the prologue. And I just kind of wanted to take a moment and breathe. And it's a lot going on in those stories, and hopefully I was able to kind of read in a way where you could distinguish the characters in terms of how I changed my voice and the tone. And I wanted to know if it would make sense for us to kind of have a discussion for the next 20 or 30 minutes based on some of the questions I asked and what came up for you with my reading. So I want to go back to these questions first, which was, how do I create a future of plenty if I haven't even acknowledged the erasure of our microbiome histories, both of soil and myself? Can I discern which are in disingenuous seeds that are still rooted in supremacy, segregation, and monoculture, and which seeds would bring forth a beloved community? And is the future of plenty about quantity or quality? But I also wanted to talk about some of the themes in the prologue, and as well as the first story that I read to you. So some of the salient reoccurring themes: soil, that we come from the soil, we return to the soil. Understanding soil is understanding oneself. Monoculture, of the seed soil is in reflection with monoculture of the mind. Pestilence, as a consequence of the monoculture of both mind and soil. And then seeds, physical and metaphysical, represents the break in monoculturals, holistic and thriving. In a way, represents biodiversity as a cure to pestilence of the mind and soil by breaking the monoculturals, breaking the monocultures. So I kind of wanted to open up the session in terms of, you know, some of the questions I had asked, but also what the readings brought up for you, what themes you connected with. Just curious, and to remind folk that this is just the prologue, but there's a lot of emphasis in soils and seeds on purpose, and also this concept of this kind of paranormal entity that you probably gathered from the story that is attacking that harmony that was there, and it being linked to a lot of what I was talking about this reoccurring dream that I would often have. Okay, so I'll keep that screen up with that reoccurring themes, and for a second so people can go through that. And also go back to these questions here. I don't know if I can stop sharing my screen, and maybe I don't know if it's helpful for me to copy and then paste those questions into the comments, so people who are assessing this through a tablet or a computer are able to read and see that. So maybe I'll do that. So
it's a good idea.
Okay, so let me do that and just go to this and just make it easier for everyone. So what I'll do is, oops, I just opened the wrong thing. So in the chat right now, I'm going to paste those questions. So let me see if I can, if they're all, okay, so those are those questions that I have. And then some of the themes. So that I wanted to not forget as well. Okay. And just kind of open it up as or kind of an organic conversation about just about anything. There's no wrong or right way to engage with questions. You don't even have to answer those questions or share. It could also be anything that's come up while you were experiencing the reading. So.
Beautiful work. First of all, thank you for sharing your work and a part of the stories that you're telling. I'm struck by the questions themselves without even diving into trying to address them or answer them. I'm just struck with the framing of the questions as not really about just individual choices, but more about moving towards collective building and the idea of beloved community, for example. So I'm just kind of like just sitting with the questions and just how profound they are as questions. And I'm glad you opened it up. People could contribute, I guess, through the chat, or they could unmute and speak as well. We're kind of an intimate enough group that could allow for a real exchange here. So
yeah, and I know there's like I just want to invite people. There's no wrong or right way. I think I just said white way. Sorry, right way to answer and ruminate over these questions. And that first question that I did pose is something that I couldn't really appreciate, understand until later in my life. But it's how my father raised me. But I didn't quite make the connections. And kind of his parallel of Martin Luther King's beloved community, moving beyond just human beings, was like really profound for me. And he's like, I don't think we should just talk about just human beings, but like beings in general and ecosystems. So I thought for me that was pretty profound. So that's why I decided to kind of implement that as a question to ponder.
Hi, Breeze.
Hi, Derek.
So I got a different kind of question for you. It's dealing with the first half of your conversation. And it's about the interconnections of like Afrofuturism, sustainability, and how we imagine the future. And so I want to go back to, you being in 2019, thinking about this book. And so I want to ask about how the relationship between the erasure of Blackness in the future and within sustainability or climate, both activism as well as the literature that comes with those things. How important is it for people of a darker hue to think about a future that's rooted in their historical or embodied knowledge and experiences, that also projects the bodies themselves into that future, right? Because when we think about mainstream sci-fi and imagination, whether that's in literature, movies, or television, Blackness is erased. And so all those lessons that come with that, like the season sankofa is dealing with, are erased. And so it is part of your work trying to get us to imagine a future without oppression of people of a darker hue, but also their presence being there, and that their history and culture has something to do with how we can move forward from this moment to this imagined future, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does make sense. And I think that's something that is really important for me, because I know, I've talked about watching things like Star Trek, where, there's a Black captain, a Black woman, but it's, they could have just plopped in a white woman, because there isn't much reflection on the fact that there is this history of how she became Black. There's that whole history of having been part of, her ancestors were probably, part of a racial caste system, which exists today. So how does that impact who she is today? How does the lack of certain access to certain materials, foods, whatever, and trying to create culture around struggle and survival, how does that inform who she is as a captain, in the future in Star Trek, which is erased? And those are what we've talked about. And when I'm writing, and a lot of Afrofuturism and fantasy does not want to erase that. So we can project a future that doesn't have to be dystopic, saying that, oh, I guess the future of Blackness, if it is a future, would mean that we're still oppressed, or the future means that we're post-racial. Like, can we have a utopian way, well, not necessarily utopian, but a more thriving, regenerative way, where we acknowledge how cultures have been to produce through particular struggles, because of colonization, because of racial caste, I want to put that in as lessons, as ways that we learn and how to connect and create this beloved community. And a lot of that comes through, when I talked about the okra seeds and the hair of an ancestor, that comes out of a horrible situation of being captured and enslaved for hundreds of years. And at the same time, there is a rich botanical legacy from the Africas into the Americas because of that, right? So how can we put that into informing our futures without it being kind of dystopic? So that's what I'm trying to work on, is how you create through those nuances when I'm creating characters, through interactions, through cultural foodways that I want to see in the future. How does that still reflect those often sordid and violent past because of colonization, because of caste, but at the same time also created communities that were able to, in spite of, thrive, survive, create innovation around not becoming decimated. So I think that's what I want to bring into those futures, and that it's not just confined to those who are racialized and live their lives as Black, but how that actually can kind of have a ripple effect to create a biodynamic, beloved community that affects all beings. So I think that's what I'm interested in, is that you can't erase that. And the book Sankofa, like Sankofa itself means, the name means you can't move forward and have a fruitful future without acknowledging and understanding your past and what the ancestors, not just human ancestors, but all of those entities have done to contribute to how you are, where you are, what you are. And that's what I'm trying to figure out. Does that answer your question? Yeah. And I think a lot of the, the science fiction, cli-fi, mainstream stuff, good intentions, but they'll plop in brown, Black, other characters of color, but they might as well just plop in a white person, because there is no nuance, there is no development of those interactions, those characters, the relationships, or those histories that really reflect on, unfortunately, those oppressive systems of the past, and how many of those communities were able to survive through it, through innovation and because of community. And that's what and certain foods and foodways and systems. And that's what I feel kind of, I don't feel very certain about when we look at a lot of the mainstream. So thanks, Derek, for bringing that up. Any other, comments or questions from whatever, Derek had said that inspire you to think of things, or other things that have come out, or the other 3 questions I had laid out? Am I still wrong or right?
Just to maybe, yeah, very thought-provoking. Like, some of the ideas kind of came to my mind are around, those characters and those stories that don't look at the past and acknowledge the erasure are really reinforcing settler colonial narratives, right? And that by linking the two, like having to look at the erasures of the past and the history of the land and the soil and the people, then you really kind of have the right to envision a liberatory future that's decolonized, right? Otherwise, you're not decolonizing if you're not acknowledging. You're building a kind of fantasy future of plenty, based on continued oppression. It's just really, it's really profound, actually, what you're doing. So
thank you. I'm like trying to, make these connections. And I have to say, a lot of this became interesting to me to explore as a novelist, because it was the nature of my dissertation work. I'm a vegan, and this was 2013 that I finished the work, but I did it from 2007 to 2013. And I was like, this doesn't make any sense. I'm seeing all of these commodities come out that are cruelty-free. They're using food science, technology, right? I'm like, but this doesn't make any sense, because even if it's vegan, how can you have cruelty-free commodities in a neo-capitalist society? Like, by default, capitalism is exploitative, extractive. You can't have that. And then it relies on racism, sexism, all that stuff, right? But I was really curious about how commodities come to you through marketing, and how they came to be is erased. And then it's re-narrated through a myth of, like, disingenuous purity. Through this rhetoric of cruelty-free, right, or clean. So that's what I became interested in. This was like 10 years ago, me really questioning veganism, if it's within the rubric of neoliberal capitalism, and if that's the future. And then, now 10 years later, wow, do you know how much I think there's $4.8 billion that was poured into like food tech, like alternatives, like alternative proteins, right? So instead of eating an actual chicken. Let's fund 10,000 startups to create yet another chicken nugget that doesn't come from a chicken. And I was blown away by the money that is available in those sectors. And because I'm a consultant in those sectors where I'm trying to bring in conscious this equity justice, which is hard when they're trying to, when their goal is profit. And that the future is always going to be saved by mostly white men. VCs fund people who are like themselves. So 97% of, I believe, the funding is going to white men who either don't care or don't know these histories. And they're creating solutions through technocratic framework. All these resources and all the land that's being used, the money, right? Billions, like billions of dollars. And at the same time, I was in Indianapolis the other week talking to these Black women who are doing food justice work, doing grassroots organization, the limited resources they have. All they need to do is get the land that they need that's clean so they can have more food sovereignty, but that's not going to work. It's not working for them because of what, more than 90% of Black farmland was already stolen. We know why, all this stuff. So I was thinking about coloniality versus modernity. Like coloniality is what you see with the food, tech, commodities, and all of the abundance, right? But the abundance in capitalist economy, that future can't be without these Black women who are struggling in Indianapolis and the loss of land and food apartheid. So that's what I began to kind of think about, that in the mainstream keeps on being told that the future of abundance and plenty are these food tech solutions that are run by most of this white bro tech culture that erases the past and even erases the reality of what it means for you to be on this soil here in the Silicon Valley, right? What did it take? Like the erasure and the displacement in East Palo Alto of those Black communities, like there's so much going on. So if you're gonna produce a future of food with technology within capitalism and erasing that, that's highly problematic. And most of you probably know this, but that's why I wanted to write about it, because it was in my dissertation work, but it wasn't very popular at the time. And now you can see in the last 2 years, I don't know if you follow the food tech space and those alternative proteins, there is so much money going in that. But so far, we still have food insecurity, right? Like when has technology really created a more level playing field for minoritized populations? And that's what the book, the chapter 1 in my book, the next chapter is going to focus on that. This question of, a lot of vegans say if the whole planet just went vegan, then it would just erase racism and all the isms. I'm like, no, because you need to get rid of capitalism and many other things. So I propose that in that, looking at hemp, like if we had a future of hemp, hemp-based economy, would it really be, would it really create an equitable food system? Then I went back to the history of, demonizing hemp and demonizing, like it used to be called weed and marijuana, but now it is cannabis sativa, right? So, just thinking about the 3 strikes and you're out. So I bring all of that up as we're talking about why certain sacred foods and sacred herbs before colonialism, that was like the bedrock or that community's, center. And then colonialization, and suddenly you can't practice that food way. You can't practice that herb. It's the demon, the devil. And then we enter this new phase where, oh, wait, the ruling class realized we can make a lot of money off of it. So, now cannabis is legal in California, and it's basically dominated by white men, right? So if that's the future, when we take something that's supposedly sustainable, because hemp, it's sustainably grown, it's actually pretty awesome to grow, but if it's within capitalism and that's the future, then I think we're screwed. So I kind of talk about that in the book as we're talking about seeds and soil and all that stuff. That's chapter 1. Yeah, I don't even know how I got off on that tangent, but the future, of food and technology. You got to stop me if I'm talking too much. So, yeah.
No, I was just going to say, Derek, was your hand up from earlier, or did you want to weigh in again?
No, I got another question, right? Because it's Breeze and I know each other, right? And so we've had plenty of conversations, but this is my first time coming to one of our talks. And so listening to, I'm trained as an African American historian, and so listening to you and looking at soil, right? I'm from the South, if you couldn't tell, right? And so this concept of the soil really is fascinating to me. And I'm thinking about hoodoo and the different portions of hoodoo, right? And so part of hoodoo is going to be not only the quote unquote magical portion of it, but the root work, right?
Yeah.
And so have you thought about including root work as part of this concept, because that's medicinal? That
Yes.
some root work also is where curses and stuff and magic and stuff comes out of. And so how, and the importance of soil, especially for African Americans in the South, and coming off that land, right? And through both enslavement and then the Jim Crow sharecropping, peonage, and all that, right? And so, so if you're going to be using it, talk to us about that, those interconnections of using that history to project into this future.
Yeah. So because that's not directly my culture, I don't know if I'm allowed to appropriate it. I do have my own, I don't know if appropriation is the right word, but with the story with these people that you first encountered, Madu and Emi, they have their herb garden. There's going to be magic and magical spells that rely on certain herbs and roots. So that is going to be part of that. And to what degree I want to root it into where they're from, which I'm going to use from my own parents' background, Mississippi and Georgia, and really understand that culture. And see how that was informed. But, for me, it'll be mostly book research and listening to my relatives versus something that I have done, that it's an embodied experience doing root work. So that's what I'm going to try, to figure out how to bring that into the future. But it's loosely related to, but, kind of the erasure of, or even demonizing of root work, and demonizing of anyone who isn't a white man doing allopathic medicine is the devil, so that type of, it gets into it because the Pototi, these women that I introduce you to, they're birth workers. So for me, that's really important, right? And there was, if you read the book Granny Midwives, midwifery was how babies came into this world until recently, where once again, it was something that was dominated by mostly women, a lot of Black women who did that in the Americas. And then it was medicalized and became, the intellectual property or sector of white men, from who have given a college education. So even that in itself, where we don't want Black women to do midwifery and deliver babies anymore because you're too dirty, right? You're always in the soil, you're in dirt, handling roots and stuff and herbs, and you're using this weird magic stuff. So even erasing that and talking about the power of that in tandem with a lot of women were burned at the stake because they were midwives, right? You're a witch. So that type of erasure, as we even move into, which I bring up in the book, when you take that history away, criminalize it and demonize it, and then it becomes, of course, the property of white men who are allopathic doctors. And then we understand, because I bring this in too, what is the future of maternal health, especially with Black women, Indigenous women, where we have higher rates of mortality, infant mortality, and ourselves dying, right? Because we don't have that anymore, because of all the multiple layers of which the soil that we were on was colonized, the taking away of the herbs and things that we used as midwives, all of this. And now we've got, these horrible rates of mortality and just lack of care, because now we have to rely on these mostly white allopathic doctors who are trained in less than 4 hours of nutrition. So if the future of maternal care is in those people's hands, sorry, so those are the things I'm just so interested in my own story with my father, where he told me that, a midwife helped because when he was born, the hospitals were segregated. His mom was 16. They weren't allowed to go to a hospital, even if it was next to them. But who kept him alive? A Black midwife who came in, knew how to, he said she knew how to set the oven high enough to keep it warm as an incubator, but not fry him, knew what type of herbs to give to his mother, to him, that's who kept him alive. And because you're keeping your community alive. So he was born prematurely. He's a Black baby born in Walnut Grove, Mississippi in 1943. Had she had a problem and needed to go to a white hospital, they would have let that baby die probably, right? So, that type of lack of community is what would kill him, or would have killed many people. So I really think about what was taken away, what was stripped away, and kind of bringing that back into the story, and that as a future, as we really talk about how so many of us are disconnected, at least in the United States, when we talk about what, like the soil itself, like when my dad would tell us that the soil is dead, but they still kind of grow. I mean, not dead, they're still growing something, but you know, the apples with wax and shininess. And I remember it just tasted like water. And I grew up on an orchard where we had heirloom apples, and my father really understood what you have to put into the soil and how you have to love the soil. And then what it bears will love you back. It was just profound. And meeting so many people where they just didn't even understand not only where their food comes from, but the importance of soil health. My dad would just like freak out if we put anything on the ground. Like if I just poured, I shouldn't be drinking soda and pouring it on the ground. He's like, don't do that. You're going to mess up the microbiome. You know, like things like that, where I didn't understand that. And then making the connections to a lot of us have gut problems because our gut health, right? The GI, because so much of what we eat, we don't have access to maybe a lot of our ancestral foods. And like, it's just profound. So the microbiome of the gut and our illnesses that are related to that being out of whack, and then thinking about how the microbiome in the soil has been colonized and polluted, and that we're not disconnected from that is, for me, quite profound. And then the fact that so many people are grossed out by soil or dirt, dirt, it's gross, it's dirt, I have to wash my hands. And, being taught that that is something that you have to be concerned about. Oops, someone's home. I hear my children, my apologies. So that's what I'm interested in. And, if you don't, and I mean, beyond that, if you just don't know your soil, you don't know yourself. And that can be the earth, the processes that go into the growth. I think that in itself is so profound because we're not disconnected from it. And how I go in the future and writing about that through fantasy is really important for me to kind of acknowledge that. And yeah, because like at first this book was just going to be about just food, but I'm like, I want to explore soil and why my father seemed really. At first I thought he was just a little OCD about it, but I'm just like, no, you're onto something, dude. He's like, yeah, thanks for telling me 40 years later after you complained the whole time about your yard duties and me telling you to compost and mulch and all that stuff. So that's what I think. And then it connected to that little kid calling me the N-word and monocultural beliefs, right? So I'm a geographer. So if you're in regions or nations where literally monocultural farming is the way to go, how is that not going to also affect thinking and being? So that's what I was trying to figure out as I'm writing this. Like there's a lot going on in the story, but I'm hoping I interconnect it well still with like the soil as this magical space for these Pototi women who can redshift, which means they're able to teleport through different times through different places, but through different multiverses as well. And that's what I'm trying to dig into more, those possibilities. So feel free to add questions or comments in the chat if you don't want to speak, by talking through the microphone.
I don't know if I have a question so much, just a comment that I drove north just this last week up to Oregon and into Southern Washington. And as I was driving, I was just thinking about how much California's changed, of course, just driving up the 5 and, all the agriculture there and seeing the Sacramento River near the headwaters and just thinking about how the waters, just how the landscape's been transformed. But I mean, your question's really profound because as I think about it, so much of my time in my week was seeing these beautiful places, but it was always from a highway, right? Which again, kind of creates the sense of a commodity, right? That you're kind of consuming this view shed with advertisements, every 15 miles, right? That kind of break it up and just kind of keep you locked into, I guess your description of just sort of monocultural understandings, right? It's an interesting challenge to break away from that and really think about it. So I guess it's more of a comment, but just reflecting on my last week, it's making things click for me in a kind of a new way.
Okay, well, thanks for sharing that. I think, I just think about just going past many rows and rows of corn, like that sense of disingenuous abundance is something that I just really anchor onto as I'm exploring, what the future of abundance would look like. Is it quantity? And then when we're talking about quantity, a lot of it is disingenuous abundance, right? So, but we don't know that. A lot of us just don't know that. We're not taught that. So there's just like a lot of layers going on when we pass, wide open farmland for miles with so much that looks like a lot of abundant food when it's within monocultural ways of growing and being. Agriculture just kind of beyond it being on the soil in those rows in that field, but what it actually represents in terms of just like cultural practices over the last 500 years for me is kind of scary.
Yeah, I am just so appreciative of your work, and so much of it for me right now is just landing so viscerally. It's almost hard to put a question into words, but I'm just particularly the second question here about, can I discern, the disingenuous seeds that are rooted in supremacy and segregation? And I think the question, the answer pretty much has to be yes, but then the follow-up is, of course, like how you do that. I mean, it's really at the core of healing and growth and transformation and all that kind of stuff, is being able to do that. But it's so hard because you only have the eyes that you have, and it's like, to a large extent, our eyes have been so colonized that it's hard for us to even suss that out. And then I was thinking about, your response to Derek's question, when you were talking about a Black actress on Star Trek, but erases, so just like putting a Black face there, but erasing all that history. And then I was thinking about, I can't even remember, I was reluctant to say it because I can't remember who it was, but I remember a really prominent actress and how she kind of was talking about, Black actress, and she was talking about how kind of the pinnacle of success would be playing a character, playing a woman that anyone could play, like playing a woman that a white woman could in essence play. So it was like almost this, like seeing success as erasing that history, as being able to erase that history. But that goes into, it's like when you have a desire to kind of erase that, then how do you get to what's genuine and what's disingenuous? So it's just a lot of stuff kind of jumbled in my head right now. But it was, I just think your writing and these questions are so profound and so important, and really just kind of take a lifetime to really get to.
Yeah, I mean, that's why I'm like, it's a lifetime answer. And
yeah.
one of the things that I always ask is how can we be our biodynamically authentic selves? Like, that's the thing. And that's purposeful, because in more regenerative farming practices, they use biodynamic, right? So, but I'm just kind of taking that further to the self, and that we're not these stagnant beings, that we are dynamic, biodynamic beings, and how to be authentically ourselves, and having that not be erased. You were just talking about, that the highest achievement for this Black actress could be that you could just play anyone. I just think about the highest compliment that Black people supposedly get from white people is that I don't think of you as Black. You do not sound Black, so, throughout my entire life, as that's a compliment, right? So, and I feel that a lot of times that's in the future of sci-fi. So I like the erasure. I think it's dangerous. I mean, we all probably agree, like erasing that is so dangerous, because then, of course, I know a lot of times people who want to keep a status quo, it's strategic erasure and ignorance on purpose. It's orchestrated, because they know when you start remembering, you start really knowing, that's where the shift happens away from, the dominant paradigm of power and control, like capitalism, colonialism. So they put a lot of effort into re-narrating and erasing at the same time. And that's the point, right? Is to maintain and hold on to power. But they do such a brilliant job of pretending they're giving you a choice, and that they're pretending that they're giving you, a more free way of being, when in fact it's a prison. And I think that's what's fascinating to me, is like you were saying, but how do you discern that? Like, I didn't know that. To me, I thought success as a Black woman is you make it as a CEO of a Silicon Valley, or corporation like Microsoft or Google, because that's what I was told the whole time. Or even back then, because I went to a PWI and I went to Harvard, that's the pinnacle of what you're supposed to achieve as a Black person. Had I known what I knew now, I don't even think I would have even gone to college. I would have just kind of done me. But I didn't know that, because those were the seeds thrown to me, and I was told this is how you cultivate it this way. But I cultivate it through monocultural white supremacist belief systems of what success and abundance are and how to create that future. I know that now in my mid-40s, but still. I have to somehow figure that out some more and not kind of get trapped in it. But I realize it's a half past the hour, and I think y'all want to end it around here and leave time for transitioning into the next session. But any quick comments or questions after?
We just want to thank you. This has been a really rich conversation, and thank you for sharing your work. And hopefully we can have you again, maybe in person one day, Sac City, to meet our students and converse some more and continue the conversation.
Yeah, definitely. So thanks everyone. And then Derek, you just asked, will I be incorporating agricultural HBCUs like Tuskegee? Yes, because one of the characters I mentioned that they're wearing a Tuskegee shirt. So I'm definitely going to do that more in my research to kind of make sure that's not erased. Because once again, food tech futures, you're always funding white men who went to predominantly white institutions like, you know, Harvard, Yale, Stanford. I never hear about, you know, the contributions from institutes like Tuskegee, right, in that. So, okay, thanks everyone. Thank you so much. Thanks for inviting me.
Thanks everyone.
If you have questions, you can write me here. I'll type this in. This is my email address in the comments. So that's me. If I don't respond quickly, it's just because I'm busy with my 4 kids, but I try to respond as quickly as possible. So, okay. Okay, thank you. Thanks, Dana. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks everyone.
Okay, bye.
Bye.